Right. I'm Terry Deacon. I began in colleges in physics, like many here. Probably gave it up quicker than most. Became very interested at the time in the excitement about cybernetic theory, which was going on in the late 70s. And information theory. In fact, my first book was a 900-page co-authored book on the Apple II computer and its design. Absurd sort of sidetrack I took early on, before I got my degree. But in the late 70s, I picked up, by virtue of some crazy guy in a bookstore, he says, you have to read, because I was reading all this, cybernetics and brains and computers and stuff. He said, you have to read this philosopher Charles Peirce. Well, I thought he was crazy, because I didn't think philosophy was worth my time. And eventually, just to please this crazy guy in the bookstore, I picked up a copy of it and started reading it, and I got so disturbed that I basically dropped out of school for a year, spent my little bit of money to buy the volumes that were then available, these totally out of order volumes of his work, and struggled through it trying to make sense of it. Got my undergraduate degree writing a thesis about this, and then said, okay, I'm going to go where the papers are. Charles Peirce's papers are buried in the library, the Houghton Library at Harvard. And I got in, remarkably. They liked the paper I wrote, I guess. And I was going to go on and do this philosophy stuff, but this is when Hillary was there, Coyne. I went to work with a guy named Israel Scheffler. Nobody was interested in it. It was the most disappointing experience I had had. Now, it turns out that Peirce has become a big topic since then. But at the time, nobody was interested. And I was just crushed. And I went to MIT, hung out with people like Chomsky and Fodor, and got even more angry. I met a guy there who was close to retirement, a neuroscientist who had discovered some of the first tracer techniques for looking at connections in the nervous system. Now, I had been studying nervous system, papers and books as a side issue when I was younger, and he sort of took me on, and sweet old guy his name was Nauta, and I began to get more and more involved in the neurosciences, and eventually sort of jumped ship into a new program in biological anthropology. But my real interest was to do neuroscience in an evolutionary way, use this new tool to do sort of evolutionary neuroscience by comparing the circuitry in different brains. And I began my career in that direction, sort of leaning to this other dark side. And spent a lot of time doing tracing studies in monkeys and rats and cats and things like that through the 90s, trying to sort of get a sense of how nervous systems had changed. By the late 90s, I left Harvard and got a position at Harvard Medical School and Boston University, and began using a new technique that I thought would tell us more about the evolution, which is cross-species transplantation, where you can take neurons from embryonic brains from one species and stick it in another brain and say, okay, now what's it doing? And one of the nice things about that is that the proteins are all different. They're effectively the same, but they're different enough so you can use an antibody to look at them. And so we were able to watch, in effect, literally watch axons find their targets in different brains. And so most of the work that I did was using pig fetuses into rats and monkeys, and eventually it turns out in humans. And it was wonderful. We could watch this connections being made. And if you want to study the, quote, computation of the brain, you need to know what's connected to what. And so it seemed to me...
Did you put pig neurons into human brains?
Yes. I didn't do it. I was not allowed, of course. But we had developed this technique that we had shown worked in rats and monkeys. And we had shown that in the rats, it actually, we gave them Parkinson's disease, basically. This is from the frozen addicts story. We learned that there was a drug that you could give to rats or monkeys, and they would become Parkinsonian. And then the question was, could we cure it? Could we stick neurons in these brains? And in fact, yes, we could. It was remarkable. And so eventually, the company Genzyme bought the patent, so to speak. We got nothing except we got to do our experiments, the usual thing. I think they sold it for huge amounts of money. And they actually transplanted 12 individuals as, quote, safety trials. the sad news is that by the time they were doing this, I knew that all the grafts were going to be rejected. But I had signed a non-disclosure agreement and all this stuff, and it went ahead. There were actually 2 real successes in that for a very short period of time. Eventually, everybody rejected their grafts or they died. These were mostly fairly old people. We had one man, actually the very first one we transplanted. Interestingly enough, he was Jewish. And he had to go to his rabbi to discuss the question as to whether having pig cells in his brain would somehow violate. And the rabbi, being the sensible man, said, "Well, you didn't eat it, did you?" It's okay. I don't see anything, in the scripture that says you can't do this. And so he went through, and he was actually the most successful case. He was frozen literally for the last couple of years of his life, had been basically spending his time in a bed or a chair. And he actually, during the first 6 to 8 months afterwards, began to get up and get around. He tried to practice golf again. He painted his front porch and put up a gate and stuff like that. Eventually didn't make it, but it was remarkable. One of the things that we found, and the reason that we were able to do this, is that it became clearer and clearer that no matter where we put the appropriate cells, we knew what kind of cells they were from where you take it in the brain. Wherever we put it, the axons found appropriate targets, or what we might call homologous targets. And they would do so if we put them in the wrong place. And what that was telling us is that across species that are as different as pigs and rats and monkeys and humans, that the same, you might call, guidance molecules were available. And so it raised an interesting question, the question I had been pursuing, having to do with,
molecular biologists already told you this?
Well, molecular biologists had not gone this far by the 1990s, but we had begun to find a lot of really conserved features. But certainly for all over the cerebral cortex, we didn't know, and we still don't know exactly what guides these axons to particular specific targets. But anyway, we were able to find it. We actually could see that not only they found their targets, but we could actually see that the synapses were functioning and so on by EM. So it was a remarkable finding, but it basically said that what's different about human brains is not that. And part of my work in anthropology and neuroscience was to try to get the question of what's different about human brains compared to other brains, and how is it the brains evolve? That's sort of what drove my work all through the 90s. I left that work about in 2000 and transplanted myself out to the West Coast, to Berkeley. And it was just after this, what I felt was a debacle in which I had signed a non-disclosure agreement, and I knew that all these, quote, safety trials were not going to help the people who thought they're, like everybody else who's like this, they expect they're going to maybe be the lucky one. So I basically sort of backed away from that work and just went back to comparative work. But it also gave me a chance to go back to earlier questions. And these are questions that sort of Peirce and his philosophy brought up for me. And in the study of brain evolution and how brains change, this question about the emergence of new structure and new function, human language, of course, being one of these classic examples of something that just doesn't seem to have any nice, neat correlates early on in other species, using totally different parts of the brain to communicate than other species do. It really caught my attention, but it was what we call an emergence question. Now, what's interesting is that, and this is where it fits in with this group, because of my work in human evolution, human origins, and cognition in a sort of indirect way, I became invited again and again to various quasi-religious groups. I became someone that the Templeton group kept calling to come to these various meetings. And I would, in fact, one of the very first ones I came to, we were all talking about what we did, and I basically said, well, no, I'm not an atheist, I'm an anti-theist. And it got everybody very upset. And we had great conversations. And it turns out that what I learned is that there's a huge interest in, quote, emergentism. And people like Peacock and others that many of you may know about sort of try to promote this idea. It was a sort of God of the gaps for some people, but it was also maybe a way out for those who were looking for a sort of compatibilism. And so I've been, again and again, invited to these groups, and been asked to publish papers in many of their books and that sort of thing. And so it's been a wonderful dialogue. I find that there is an interest in this question that we're about to struggle with. That's in even, not the fundamental theology, but in people, so for example, I just got an award from a Unitarian group called the Institute for Religion in the Age of Science. And they gave me an award for this current book I just produced. Because they're interested in these questions. These are not the sort of hardliners, but the people who are sort of, almost secularists. Right. So it's a very interesting issue. So let me just say that a couple of things about what I'm interested in, what I could change my mind about. First of all, right now I'm very much interested in rethinking the very concept of information. I think we have a remarkably powerful physical and logical theory of information that dates from Claude Shannon, of course. But of course it has nothing to say about reference, has nothing to say about anything normative. Now, when you provide information to me, there's a normative feature there. And in biology, our understanding of information both has reference and normativity, so that the Shannon model is not good enough. And so I've been struggling to make sense of this idea in evolutionary biology, and I think it's really a crucial question for the origins of life people. What is, how is it that a molecule becomes about something? That's a really interesting question. We assume that that's true in hindsight. We look back, but it's
not all of us.
Okay, thank you. You philosophers, I'll let you think whatever you want. So that's been really interesting to me, and I've been struggling with a way to think that through and to become formal about it, to really make it clear what I think that relationship is, because I think it has to be something that we can make sense of. So in this respect, there's a couple of things that I first of all think to be the case, but I'm willing to be convinced of. Number one, I don't think brains are like computers. I've spent a lot of time with brains, and they just don't look like computing devices to me.
We all do.
What's that?
We all do spend a lot of time with brains.
Oh, yes, okay, thank you. And yet, I'm not saying that it's not a functionalist, physical kind of story. I just don't think our understanding of computation is big enough to accomplish what we want to say about this. And I'm really interested in how to expand that notion. Because I give all the meaning to my computer. My computer's like a car engine, but I've assigned various values to what it's doing and so on. If I'm a computer too, then who's assigning it? You get the same problem sort of running back and back and back. Now, a number of people say, oh, no, it's just because we're now situated in the world. Well, my computer's situated in the world, and certainly one that runs an arm in a factory is situated in the world. I don't find any reason to think there's somebody home there. I think there is something more that we have to deal with. I'm willing to be convinced that, no, I'm just a computer and all this stuff is just running programs. That's one thing I'm willing to be convinced of, but I need to have good science that tells me how to think that through. The second one, and I'm glad to be in a room with a bunch of physicists, is that I don't think that understanding mind, consciousness, or how brains work requires us to do quantum theory. A whole lot of people, as you probably know, think that somehow consciousness requires us to understand entanglement and things like that.
I wouldn't say it's a whole lot of people.
No, okay, that's fine.
We're in this room.
I'm glad to hear that, but I'm willing to be convinced that you need to know quantum theory to understand how brains work. But I don't think so myself. I think you're right that the tools certainly could be relevant, but to understand some of these rather strange features that we don't really have an explanation for, we have great description of. To understand why I have this experience seems to me to be something that I've never felt I needed to do. Now, I'm not a quantum physicist, so maybe I missed something. But that's sort of one of my questions.